Hello, Luke. So good evening, everyone. This is going to be our final tutorial tonight. So I thank you for actually joining me in almost all the tutorial sessions. You guys have been consistently there, which is really good, because otherwise it would have been quite lonely if it had only been me who had been there. So I thank you for always being there. And I'm more than sure you're quite excited about the fact that this course is about to be finished and you are getting closer to finishing your LLB. I mean, you know, that's one step that would get you closer to your goal of becoming a solicitor of Australia at some point. Okay, so for tonight, there are three things I would like to cover. I'd like to cover the topics that are likely to be covered in the final written assessment. I will also be discussing the assessment structure and some assessment tips on how to deal well in an assessment. Now, before I start talking about any of these topics, would anyone wish to raise a point? Martin is just 3 units away. Martin, are you about to finish? You just need 3 more subjects, 3 more courses. That's really good. Are you able to finish it in term 1? Not yet. Oh, okay. Well, that must be exciting for you. Okay. So just in case you become a solicitor, will you continue with your scuba diving you know, the hobby and job that you have? Oh, you're also an IT consultant. That's really good. Okay, good. Okay, any questions before we begin? So probably not. So let me begin by going through the assessment structure before we talk about the topics. So the final assessment is going to be on Wednesday. I mean, the final assessment is going to be released on Wednesday in Moodle. That's going to be Queensland time. And there will only be 3 questions in the final assessment. And you will be required to answer all of them. Each of the 3 questions is worth 20 marks and carries an equal weight. And what will then happen is that the 60 marks will be converted to 40% of your final grade. So in other words, if you had 60 marks, yeah, you'll end up with, that becomes 40% of your final grade. I'm not sure about the maths, but it will be converted to 40% of your final grade. And all questions are going to be in a problem format. Now, the important thing you need to remember is that all the questions I'll be asking in the final written assessment will be patterned after the tutorial questions that we've had. In fact, most of the, well, all 3 questions will bear facts that are almost quite similar to what we've covered in the tutorial discussions that we've had. So you won't come across a tutorial problem that seems to be quite foreign or something that we haven't covered before. So what it means, therefore, is that you will be in a good position to do the final assessment if you actually go through the tutorials that we've covered in the course. And I will shortly tell you what the topics will be, or probably I should. So let me just go through the topics, and then I'll go back. So there will only be 3 questions, as I mentioned. It will be in any of these 4. So one could be on construction of terms, the other one could be on capacity to contract, third would be privity, and the final one would be on Australian consumer law. So there will be one of these topics that will not be assessed in the final assessment. So that's going to be 1 topic per question. So I won't have, yeah, that's right. So I will avoid making it very complicated so that you need to address so many other elements of contract law in a single topical question. I will likely ask you to focus just on a single aspect of contract law. So which would mean, therefore, that given the fact that we've had tutorial discussions in relation to any of these topics, it will be a good idea for you to review the tutorials that we had in this course relating to these topics. So it will be on any of these 3 topics. One of them will not be covered, but for sure, the questions will be on just any of these topics. Any questions so far? Now, obviously, because this is contracts law, you will need to be very familiar with the essential requirements before we can say that there is a valid and binding contract. So you'd have to learn about the rules concerning ad idem or the meeting of the minds. You should be a bit familiar with the rules on consideration and so on. But I will see if I will just make an assumption that the contract is valid and binding, and then just ask you to focus on an aspect of contract law. But it is crucial that we will focus the assessment questions on any of these 4 topics. Do we have any questions so far? I won't be discussing these because they've been sufficiently covered in the tutorial notes as well as in the lecture podcast of Anthony Marinac. And we've obviously discussed this in detail during the tutorials that we've had. So I won't be discussing them tonight. And we don't really have the time. Unless you have any questions, and I'd be happy to answer them on these topics. So none so far. Feel free to ask me a question in a short while. Now, I'm just going to backtrack and discuss, and go through the assessment criteria. Now, these assessment criteria are actually in the course profile. And what I would like to highlight is that the assessment criteria are actually very similar to the IRAC format. So, for example, in terms of assessing your answers, it is crucial that you're able to correctly and thoroughly identify and describe the issues. And that is important because oftentimes students would end up misidentifying what the issue is. And obviously, if you get the issue wrong, you will end up having the wrong answer. So you begin by identifying what exactly is the legal problem involved, what exactly is the legal issue involved. So that's crucial, and you will be assessed on that subject, and that will be 20% of the mark. You will obviously need to be able to correctly and thoroughly identify and describe the rules and legal principles. And then part of the IRAC format, there should be the correct application of the rules to the facts. So there should be a correct and thorough analysis of the issues with exceptional critical insight. So that's when you try to apply the law to the facts. And then that will lead to the conclusion. And we're talking of a well thought out conclusion, which comprises 10% of the mark. And then finally, the observance of proper structure and format, which comprises 10% of the mark. Now, let me just discuss, therefore, so bearing this in mind, this is the assessment criteria. And if you wanted to, if you go to Moodle, you will also see the marking rubric as well, so that you would know what constitutes a high distinction way of identifying the issue, and what would constitute a mere pass or even a fail. So there is a very detailed marking rubric in Moodle, which was used in the course of marking your legal memorandum assessment. And we will be using the same detailed marking rubric in assessing your final assessment. But what I wanted to do was just to highlight the fact that if you look at the assessment criteria, which is in the course profile, this actually follows the IRAC format. And you will observe, therefore, that the bigger part of the mark is actually in relation to analysis and application. The rule is important. I mean, being able to correctly and thoroughly identify and describe the rule and legal principles are important, and that's why they're given 20% of the final of the mark. But it bears repeating that I am not impressed, or the marker cannot be impressed, if all you do is to state the legal principle. And I'm going to be covering this when I talk about assessment tips. And the reason for that is that we have an open book final assessment. And because it's open book, it should be very easy for you, therefore, to be able to state the legal principle or the law or the case law. It would be very easy because it is open book. So for that reason, if all you do is to be able to state and describe the rule or the legal principle, it doesn't count for much. And it's actually the analysis and the application which are crucial at any point, because that's when you begin to link what the law is with the facts. And if you were to be a solicitor, that's when you try to link what the problem of your client is with the rules or the legal principles. And if all you do, therefore, is to tell your client that, this is the law, this seems to be the problem, but you're not able to draw a close link between what the rule is and what the law is, meaning you're not able to apply the rules and the law to the facts of or to the legal problem of your client, then you're not really being helpful. So the analysis and the application have the biggest weight in terms of assessing the final assessment, or in most assessments anyway. Okay, so we'll try to cover. We'll try to go back to this in a short while. So let's just cover some of the basic assessment tips. And what I would like to emphasize is that law is different in terms of answering the assessments. It is different because perhaps unlike other courses, such as, natural sciences or perhaps even in the arts, you can get away with being able to demonstrate your knowledge of a subject through a multiple choice assessment. Or it could even be a quiz. And therefore, you're able to demonstrate your knowledge of the law. But as a solicitor, your job is not just be able to articulate and demonstrate your knowledge of the law. Your job in the end is actually to be able to provide legal advice to a client. And a legal advice is always in the context of a legal problem, of a factual problem that your client is facing. Always. And more than that, not only is it a question of you being able to competently inform your client about what the law is, but you should be able to closely inform the client as to what the law is in relation to his problem, so that at the end of the day, you're then able to provide legal advice. And the legal advice can only be given in the context of the actual factual problem of your client. So that is one crucial part of the job of a lawyer. That's one part of your job in doing well in the assessment. The second aspect, and this is really crucial, is that at the end of the day, being a lawyer or doing the job of a lawyer involves advocacy. It's actually about being able to make a legal argument. So that you will notice that there are always two sides to a case. That's why you've got the applicant or the plaintiff, and you've got the defendant, and both can actually be correct. And oftentimes, therefore, the job of the lawyer is to be able to persuade either the jury or the judge that your position is correct. So that is where advocacy comes in. That is where the art of argumentation comes in. That's where the art of persuasion comes in. So you will notice that Martin and a few other of your classmates had asked questions as to, had provided very persuasive alternative answers to what I suggested were actually the model answers, either to the legal memorandum assessments or the online written quizzes. But it's one thing for you to be able to provide an alternative answer, but it's totally another to be able to argue why your answer is actually the correct one or the better one. Okay? Because you're actually able to use almost any legal principle in any way that you want. That's only one part of it. But being able to convince the judge or the jury or the marker, for that matter, that yours is the correct and the preferable answer requires the art of argumentation, advocacy, and persuasion. So in other words, if all you do is to say that this is the law, and therefore this is the way we apply the law to the facts, and you leave it there, you're hardly going to be able to make a persuasive case. And that is really crucial because, as I said, at the end of the day, much of the way that you provide answers to a legal assessment is actually not just being able to show a mastery or a knowledge of the law, but being able to use your knowledge of the law so that you're able to advocate a position in behalf of your client. And that all obviously means, therefore, that you will be ineffective as a lawyer if you therefore end up saying that, on the one hand, this is what the law can possibly be. And on the other hand, this is possibly what the law probably is in relation to your case facts. That won't do. You need to be able to provide a clear legal advice to a client by saying, this is likely the way that a judge or a jury will look at the case facts. So you have to be able to pin down a clear legal position. Now, the only time you will probably be ambivalent about what the conclusion is, or kind of ambivalent and not being very categorical about your statement of the law and your application of the law. The only time that will probably happen is if there is a fact or a case fact that is actually missing. So if there are certain facts which are crucial to you being able to make a definitive conclusion or a definitive legal advice, then only then can you probably be ambivalent, depending on what the case facts are. But if the facts seem to be complete, it is your duty as a lawyer or as a law student to be able to clearly articulate what the legal position is, what the correct legal advice should be. And let me emphasize, as I said, at the end of the day, it's always about advocacy. It's always about the art of legal persuasion. It's all about the art of legal argumentation, which is why lawyers are very different from most other professions, because it's all about trying to convince someone that yours is the correct legal position, or yours is the correct legal answer. And that makes a difference between a good lawyer and an ordinary lawyer. Because an ordinary lawyer is probably able to say, this is the law. But the ability to be able to argue that before the judge. So if you were to examine, if you were to look at, the brilliant trial lawyers, or even if you were able to look at very good pleadings, you will see the way that they present the law. And you will see, therefore, that in their presentation of the law, they're actually trying to provide a legal argument so that everything logically leads to a conclusion that would justify and show and demonstrate that the position of their client is the correct one. So that is what being a lawyer is all about. It's mainly about. Okay, so the more forceful you are, the more confident you are in your answer, and the more the more you read an answer, and you can see the passion and the way that an argument is being made, the more convincing that answer is. Okay, so let's just backtrack a bit. So as I said, so let's start preparing and reviewing for the assessment early, because the assessment is on Wednesday. Now, obviously, it's crucial that you're able to cite cases if you could, because they provide the authority to your answers. And this is really crucial in contract law. We had you've noticed disruption. Well, I wouldn't call it disruption, but you've probably noticed some issues in the way that our course was ran, because we had some students or a student who kind of, raised questions as to the correctness of the answers. And the way that the alternative answers were presented, it was actually on the basis of statute or enactments. And more importantly, the statutes or the legislation that had been cited actually referred to UK legislation. And because Australian contract law, as we know, is based on the common law, it actually means it is based on case law. It is based on judicial precedents, mainly, except perhaps for the Australian consumer legislation, or except perhaps for those instances where the law has decided that it will intervene by implying certain conditions or certain terms into every single contract. But in general, Australian contract law is based on case law. And because Australian contract law is based on case law or on the common law, it is crucial, therefore, that we're able to identify whatever cases seem to be relevant and crucial to be able to articulate what the correct answer should be. And because we're dealing with the common law, it all obviously means that we're not limited to case law that has been developed in Australia. We borrow mainly, in fact, from case law from the UK. And a lot of them are actually ancient in the sense that, some of them are as far back as the 1600s. Okay, let me just have a look at some of the comments in the chat box, because they seem to be relevant. That's right. So a good point from Martin. I always learned every time you make a statement of law or rule, support it with a reference. That is very good advice. So I really don't like to see an answer where there is a reference to the law or a statement of a legal principle or a case law without the proper citation. So when I say the proper citation, especially in the context of contract law, which, as I said, is mainly built on the common law, I don't want to see a statement of a legal principle without a reference to an actual case. Because what it means is that if you are not citing the proper, you're not providing the proper citation, if there is no proper legal reference, there are two problems there. It's either, one, you're plagiarizing, in the sense that you're trying to own an idea as if it were yours, when in fact it had already been stated by somebody else. So that's plagiarism. Or two, you're actually stating your own legal opinion as to what the law is. And really, that is of zero value. I'm not interested in what your opinion is as to what the law is, or as to what the legal principle is. I'm not interested in it. You need to be able to tell me what the case law is. So what the legal principle is according to case law. So the referencing there is very crucial. So in other courses, perhaps, if it's political science or if it's business or it's marketing, you probably don't need to provide referencing. You can even rely on your own experience. But if it is a LAWS assessment, you need to be able to provide proper legal referencing. So is that clear? So that's very important advice from Martin. So in other words, one easy way actually for a marker to be able to assess the quality of an answer is by looking at the references. So the fewer references there are, meaning, in other words, the fewer citations there are to case law, especially in the context of a contract law problem, it provides a signal that the student hasn't really provided, hasn't really put in enough time or effort into the assessment. That is a clear signal. It's a red flag that the student hasn't put in enough effort. And that's quite evident when you look at the footnotes. So when there is a dearth or scarcity of case law in the footnotes, it's a red flag. It's a very strong signal. It's a very big sign, in strong red letters, that this student hasn't really put in the effort. And I want to be very clear that in the final written assessment, if I see that the student hasn't really been putting in the effort, there is a very big likelihood that that student will fail in the final assessment. Okay, so I want to be clear about that. But if I see a genuine effort on the part of the student, because I can see clearly an attempt to draw on case law in articulating what the legal rule is or what the legal principles are, then that's a very good sign. That, that provides a strong incentive on the part of the marker to let the student pass, because there has been a genuine attempt and there has at least been an articulation of the law. Okay, so going back, cite cases if you could. So I don't want to see any unreferenced statement of the law. That is really bad. Okay, I don't want to see that, especially in contracts. Now, I'd like to speak a bit as well as in relation to format, because you will recall that part of the assessment criteria is actually format. And so that's the way that you write your answers. And we look at the ability to be able to apply the rules of grammar as well. And so therefore, a good piece of legal writing actually involves writing, well, what are we doing here? So we're talking about verbatim. Okay, so and we'll talk about sentences in a short while. Now, what I would like to emphasize as well is avoid verbatim quotation of cases. So you've read a lot of the cases in their original, and some of them, some of the statements of some of the rulings in cases have actually been cited verbatim in the textbook. I don't want to see them cited verbatim. Because what simply happens is that if you're citing cases verbatim, you're actually unable to draw a close link between the legal principle as stated in the case and the case facts. So, but on the other hand, if you're able to restate the legal principle in your own words, chances are you'll be able to restate the law in such a way that it promotes and advocates for your legal position or for the conclusion that you're trying to arrive at. So that's one. But the second reason is, if all you're doing is really just providing a verbatim quotation of cases, because remember, there will be a word count as well. I can't remember yet what the word count is, but it's probably not more than 600 words per legal problem, or maybe not more than 800 words per legal problem. I don't want a student being able to show that there's an attempt to meet the word count limit, both in terms of the minimum and the maximum, by just making a verbatim quotation of cases. And that's really a lazy way of doing it. It's a very lazy way of doing it. So what I would like to see is that you should be able to paraphrase and use your own words when it's cited in the cases whenever possible. So I would, at the most, I'd like to see perhaps 2 sentences. If you were to quote aspects of a judicial decision. But a verbatim quotation of cases involving, what, 3 or 4 sentences, I don't want to see that. Because it's a very lazy way of answering a legal assessment, especially an online take-home assessment. And secondly, as I said, it's a very weak way of stating your case, because you're just simply copying the case law and being unable to draw a close connection between what the legal principle is as stated in the case law and what the facts are. Now, moving forward, it's also crucial. So again, why am I emphasizing this? I am emphasizing this because unlike an objective type exam, and that can actually happen in some jurisdictions where the admission to law practice is on the basis of a bar exam, and a lot of times they're actually multiple choice questions, such as the New York bar, for example. So therefore, because they're objective type, you can actually demonstrate your knowledge of the law by correctly identifying what. I get trampoline in the room. Okay, ask William. So in some jurisdictions, for example, they do have multiple choice questions as a way of assessing the knowledge of an examinee of the law. And in that case, these are invigilated examinations. But as far as, especially in the case of contract law, and as far as our assessments are concerned, this isn't simply an objective assessment of your knowledge of the law. We're really trying to look at not only knowledge, but the mastery of the law and the ability to apply your knowledge of the law to the case facts. So having said that, it's important that you don't just, kind of flood your paper with a citation of various legal principles, which is possible. So I don't want to see, just legal principle after legal principle, even with the citations being stated, being found in the answer. We need to see how these principles relate to the case facts. As I said, I'm not impressed with a mere repetition of the law because this is an open books assessment. Okay, so that's one. Now, going back to the format, therefore, in the manner that you provide your answers, you will recall that 10% of your assessment is going to be based on format. That is how you write your answer. That is how you present your answer. So in relation to this, for example, if you use, let's say, 10-point font, a font size of 10 points, or you use improper margins, in other words, I don't know, instead of having, what is that usually, 3.15 cm? On each side, you end up just having, let's say, 1 cm in terms of margin. That shows very unprofessional way of presenting your answers. So make sure that you make it presentable. Observe proper margins, observe proper font sizes, because that is part of the format. Now, more importantly, therefore, make sure that you correctly follow the rules of grammar. Make sure that you edit your work properly, avoid typographical errors, and oftentimes there's a lot of them. Now, one aspect by which there are usually deductions would occur when a student uses, writes sentences that are quite long. These are usually compound and complex sentences. And so that in a single sentence would probably occupy 4 lines in a paragraph. And that's not good writing. That is not good legal writing. Your job is to be, the simpler the sentences are, the easier it is to be able to see the point that you're trying to drive at. So use simple sentences and use connected prose and coherent sentences in your answers. Because what often happens is that some students would kind of just dump legal principle after another, and therefore a reader or a marker is unable to see the connection between all of these different sentences. So the sentence, any legal principle that you state or any case law that you're citing, they should actually form a single narrative that leads to the conclusion that you have arrived at. So what you're doing is actually citing the legal principles, trying to apply the legal principles or the case law to the facts, so that a reader goes with you in that journey, in the kind of advocacy or argumentation that you're making. You're holding the reader's hand and telling the reader or the marker that this is what the law is, this is the way we apply the law to the facts, and therefore, if you follow me, this has got to be the logical conclusion. So there is a narrative, there is a story you're making, there's an argument you're making every time you state something in your assessment. It also means that you should avoid answers that use bullet points, because that's not the way lawyers write. You're not going to be making a pleading or an application where you use bullet points. We wish to see proper sentences and not bullet points or phrases and so on. And as I pointed out, the answering an assessment task actually involves legal argumentation. So you're advocating a position. You're trying to argue that the law should actually be applied to the advantage of your client, or the law actually favors the position of your client. So do not lose this. You should always think about this, that every time you make a statement, so in other words, when you provide an answer, for example, in your final written assessment, you already know what the answer is. You already have the conclusion. So if you've been given a problem, meaning that you have a client who tells you this is the problem, after listening to the problem, knowing what the law is, you then arrive at what the conclusion is in your mind. Your job then is to be able to articulate clearly on paper what the proper conclusion is, but instead of just saying that this is the conclusion, this is my legal advice to you, you're actually saying this is my legal advice, but that's because of this. So in other words, your job at the end of the day is to be able to provide legal advice. That's the job of a solicitor. But before you get to that point of providing legal advice, it actually means you begin by saying, okay, this is my legal advice because I think this is what the legal issue is. This is the problem that you're facing. This is the legal problem. This is the legal issue. And given that this is the legal issue, this is actually what the law is. This is the legal principle according to case law. And then if we apply, therefore, the case law to your facts, it will lead us to the conclusion that this is what is the correct legal position. So again, as I said, that involves legal argumentation. And what you're trying to do is actually to convince the marker as well that yours is the correct and more persuasive answer. So it's always open for a student to be able to argue a different answer from that which is provided in a model answer. That's fine. Because, as we said, there are always at least two aspects to every dispute, to every legal dispute. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to who becomes more persuasive. Who's able to convince the judge? Who's able to convince the marker? Now, what it also means is that in terms of applying the law and the legal principle, for example, between one where you need to be able to make it's difficult to argue your position, as opposed to one where it's quite simple. Don't make things difficult. Go for the, a correct solution. So, for example, if you remember, we had that online quiz involving, or part of the tutorial problem, an instance where somebody had invited an entertainer, and that entertainer had then brought in equipment which short-circuited the electrical system, and which led to the burning of the house. So on the one hand, an argument could probably be made that, the burning of the house was not just because of the equipment that had been brought in by the entertainer. It could have been that the electrical system in the house was old and faulty. I mean, you could make out that case. But but why bother with that when the facts clearly show that the cause of the house being burned down was actually the overloading of the electrical system as a result of the equipment that had been brought in? So don't make things difficult. Look for the easy answer. Okay? And as I said, because the questions are usually framed in terms of, as a solicitor, provide legal advice, your job at the end of the day is to be able to clearly articulate at the conclusion, at the end of your long answer, what the advice is that you should be giving to the client. So what exactly is the conclusion? And so therefore, always bear in mind that you have a client who has a problem. And so therefore, your client is not just interested in, your client is not just interested in knowing what the law is. So your client is not interested in trying to have a crash course on the law. The client is not interested in that. The client is interested in knowing he or she has a problem. What exactly is the law, and how does that relate to my problem? So what if this is my problem? What exactly is the law? Give me some legal advice. So that is your job in coming up with an answer, being able to provide clear legal advice to a client. And obviously that legal advice is built on a correct and proper identification of the legal issue is, being able then to identify what the correct legal principles are or what the case law is, and then applying the legal principles to the facts of the case. Now from Luke, I've been told 30 words or less per sentence. Okay, well, I would think that in general, it's really difficult for markers to be able to count how many words there are in a sentence. No one does that. The only instance actually when there is actually a word count will be when there is a verbatim citation of statements based on the case law. So when you lift certain passages of case law, making a verbatim quotation of what is in the case law, typically what happens is there will be a requirement for a word count, because then you typically have to send it out, usually in a smaller font size, and there will be rules on formatting as well. But typically, we don't really do a count of words, but the longer the sentences are, we get a sense that, as pointed out, you're making a long-winded sentence, and that becomes more difficult to follow. It becomes more difficult to kind of understand the point that you're making. So try to make simple sentences. And so it will be helpful for you to follow the IRAC format, which means issue, rule, application, and conclusion. So let's just go to that a bit quickly. So I need to emphasize this because in terms of answering an assessment, typically, in terms of answering an assessment in a laws course, it is often suggested that you follow the IRAC format. And some people will question, why do we have to follow the IRAC format? Why do we have to present it in such, why do you have to present an answer in such a way that you begin by identifying the issue, then stating the rules, then applying the rules to the facts, and then coming up with a conclusion? Why do we have to do this? The reason is the IRAC format is quite, in a sense, proven in the sense that the IRAC format leads to a very logical conclusion. the way that you present your answer following the IRAC format leads you to a natural and logical conclusion. In other words, you cannot just come up with a conclusion without really being unable to know what the legal issue is or what the legal problem is. So you can't have a conclusion if you don't know what the legal issue is or what the legal problem is. So you always begin to identify what the legal issue is. So if you've misidentified the legal issue, you are likely to have arrived at a wrong conclusion. For example, we know, as I mentioned already, that that you will be assessed on 4 possible topics, including privity, for example. And therefore, if the legal issue is on privity, and then you kind of focus on the construction of a term, or you're focusing on ad idem, or the notion of consideration, when in fact, the basic issue really is the notion of privity, in the sense that whether or not a person who is not a party to a contract may actually be bound by the terms of the contract, or could actually gain some benefits under the contract, even if that person is not bound by is not a party to the contract. So, if you therefore speak from the viewpoint of consideration, when in fact the bigger legal issue is about privity, then chances are you would end up with the wrong conclusion. So it's crucial, therefore, that you always begin by being able to identify what exactly is the legal issue involved. And then, if you know what the legal issue is, you then try to find a way to answer that legal issue by stating what the law is. So in other words, what you're saying is, in general, if this is the legal problem, we know this to be the law. These are the legal principles according to case law, especially in the context of contracts, or maybe under the Australian consumer law in relation to those which involve consumer contracts. So you've identified what the legal issue is, then you're saying, you're making the case that this is what the law is according to common law. And then what you then need to do is to be able to show that these are the legal principles according to the common law. And if we apply them, therefore, to the case facts, it leads us naturally to this specific conclusion. So the application of the rules and the legal principles to the case facts is really crucial, because that's where the argumentation and the art of advocacy comes in. And so therefore, you will notice, therefore, that the IRAC format, as I pointed out earlier, is closely linked to the assessment criteria that we have, which means, if you will notice, 20% of the assessment criteria relates to issue, correct and thorough identification and description of the issues, that's 20%. And then the rule, correct and thorough identification and description of the rules, legal principles, 20%. And then the bulk of the marks will go to analysis and application. And that is when you're able to correctly and thoroughly analyze the issues with exceptional critical insight. So that's the high distinction answer. And that's when you apply the rules to the facts and then come up with a well thought out conclusion. And what it also means is that a well thought out conclusion naturally is one that is logical, according to the previous statements that you've made. So in other words, if this is what you're saying, it will lead to a natural conclusion such as this. So therefore, it will be very incoherent if this is what you're saying, and then all of a sudden you have a different conclusion. So you should end up with a well thought out logical conclusion on the basis of the identification of the issues and the rules and the application of the rules to the case facts. Okay, so I guess that's it. Any questions? So these are the possible assessment topics: construction of terms, capacity contract, privity, and Australian consumer law. And as a reminder, I would strongly encourage you to revisit the tutorials that we've had in relation to these topics, because the final assessment questions are going to be closely related to the problem scenarios that were developed as part of the tutorial questions. So many of them, well, they'll be very similar to the tutorial problems that we previously had. Questions?
Yeah, Manjo, I just had a question about when it comes to accessing the exam.
Yes.
So when it becomes available, once we go into it,
Mm-hmm.
is it like do we have to download it, or is it we type straight into the Moodle page somewhere? Or I'm just wondering how it's set out.
That's right.
Is it a time thing? So are we going to be locked out if we log out for a period of time, or?
Good question. You will be downloading a file which contains the assessment tasks. And so therefore you can answer it at your free time. So it's a downloadable file. Yep.
Manjo, will this be uploaded?
Your answer, Celine.
Sorry?
Which one will be uploaded? Your answers?
Will this session be...
Yeah, that's right. This has been recorded, and I will upload the recording on YouTube. And I will try to post the link by tonight, the link to the YouTube recording.
Thank you.
Now, there's a question from Heidi. Has this been a previous assessment for earlier students? The question probably is the type of assessment questions I'm asking, were they kind of similar to past assessments? Heidi, is that the question? I can't really answer that because this is the first time I'm teaching this course. This had previously been handled by Anthony Marinac. And so it's difficult for me to say. Except that, if you notice the way that Anthony has created the previous tutorial questions, these were actually his. You can then say that the kind of final assessment questions you will have, because the final assessment questions kind of follow the pattern as indicated in the tutorial questions, they are likely to be similar to the previous assessments for contracts. But I am making the assessment questions this time, so there might be some changes or some difference, but I wouldn't be able to identify what they will be. Can you lecture contract B as well? It's going to be Anthony Marinac, I think, will be teaching that. I think that's in the first term because I won't be teaching in term 1. I'll be focusing on research. We're only allowed to actually teach 2 terms each year, so I'm not teaching contract B this time, but Anthony will be. I teach other subjects. I teach constitutional law and administrative law. Yep. So Martin, for example, was my student in constitutional law. I'll also be teaching public international law and human rights law in term 3, I think. Was it in term 2? So this is actually the first time that I've taught contract A, but I typically teach constitutional law and administrative law. There is no contract B in term 1. Okay. So yeah, so contract B will probably be taught in term 2. It's likely going to be taught by Anthony Marinac. So there are rules around FSL, and which means therefore that there are certain courses which we usually can't teach because we might exceed the rules on FSL. So, but for the coming school year, I'll be teaching administrative law again, and constitutional law, and public international law. There's a question from Sophie. Do we have word limits for the final assessment? The answer is yes. So when it comes to word limits, there are, I'm going to go back to what Martin said in a short while. Now, there are 2 aspects of the word limits. One is the minimum. There is a minimum and there is a maximum. So for example, if I indicate in the final assessment, and this is likely going to be the case, that the maximum is 800 words, I wouldn't want to see an answer where you only have about 500 words. Okay, so your in terms of the word count, it should be close to 800 words. So probably around the minimum, maybe 650 or 700 words. But anything shorter than that would probably indicate to me that you haven't really put in enough effort to the assessment. So there will be a word limit. Most likely it will be 800 words. And as far as the word limit is concerned, it only refers to any statement you make in the body. It doesn't count the footnotes. And you will likely be asked to provide a bibliography as well. So the bibliography will not be counted in the word count. Now, let me just make a statement concerning footnotes because I kind of forgot to mention it there. So the footnotes is actually important in terms of legal writing because not only do they provide the legal reference to anything that you've stated in the body of your answer, So that's where you provide the citation. That's what the purpose of the footnotes is. But the footnotes are also crucial because they're actually areas in which you can expound on a principle of law. Okay, so let's clarify. When you therefore provide an answer to an assessment task, the body of your paper focuses on answering or providing legal advice to a client. So it focuses on providing an advice based on the legal problem that your client faces. So that's the main focus of the body of your assessment answer, of your paper. So when you read that, as we said, if you go through the IRAC format, all of them lead to a conclusion that is in the form of a legal advice to a client. And that, as we said, involves advocacy and persuasion and legal argumentation. But oftentimes, it is possible that there are aspects of law, for example, statements of the law or case law, which is quite complicated or which probably needs some kind of exposition or an elaboration. But then again, what would happen is that if you elaborate too much on a case in the body of your written piece, what then happens is, on the one hand, you're trying to provide legal advice to the client, but at the same time, you're trying to elaborate or explain what the legal principle is. So in other words, you end up with two narratives. You end up with two stories. On the one hand, you're providing legal advice to the client by following the IRAC format. But then on the other hand, given the fact that the case may be quite complicated, and then you elaborate on it, there is a different story, a different narrative you're making, and that can get confusing. So what then typically happens is a good way to write an answer would be that expositions of what the case law is should actually be found in the footnotes, so that any reader or any marker who wishes to dig deeper into what the legal principle is examines your footnote. And so therefore the footnote, especially if you provide a footnote where you try to elaborate on a legal principle, is also a way for you to be able to demonstrate your mastery or your understanding of the law without putting it up there as part of your final answer. And as I said, footnotes are not covered in the word count. Okay, so can you see therefore the value of footnotes? So the footnotes do at least two things. One, the footnotes you have the footnotes because that's the way by which we cite our legal sources, the legal references. But more importantly, the footnotes are ways by which we try to elaborate or probably even explain what the proper case law might be. And that is the proper way of legal writing. So you don't want to elaborate or explain too much what consideration, for example, is, or the notion of privity is in the body. You could, meaning one or two sentences should be fine. Because remember, for example, the notion of consideration or the principle of privity of contracts is covered in one long chapter. And what you're trying to do is to be able to explain the notion of consideration or privity in a matter of few words. And so therefore, how do you do that in just 2 or 3 sentences? Because you cannot overwhelm a reader by having an exposition of certain legal principles in the body. That's when you do it in the footnotes. Now, there is a question, and then I'll go back to what Martin has said. Is there an example of this in Moodle? Yes, there is an example, and that is shown by the model answers that I have. So if you look at my Moodle and the model answers I have to the legal memorandum assessment, or when I try to explain the correct answers to the online quizzes, you will notice that I often have footnotes. And it is in the footnotes that I provide further explanation of what the correct legal position is. So in that case, therefore, I have a kind of a simplified narrative that leads to a correct legal advice. And if a reader wishes to have a better understanding of a case or a legal principle, then that reader or the marker will look at the footnote. So in other words, for example, if I cite a case law and we know the facts every single case is usually driven on the basis of certain facts, and you want to be able to contrast the facts of a particular case to the facts at hand. So sometimes you need, therefore, to be able to state what the actual facts are of a case that you're citing. So you do that in the footnotes, because otherwise, if you put it there in the body, you're wasting too much space. In the body, you cite what the case law is according to the case or to the common law, but the actual exposition of what the case facts are, they should be found in the footnotes. Okay, so are we clear about the rule of the importance of footnotes? Now, we have a bibliography. There are two aspects of the bibliography. One is it's supposed to be kind of be a list of the cases or the statutes that you've cited. But more importantly, a bibliography also provides an indication of whatever sources that you've actually consulted, even though they may not have been cited in your answer. So, for example, you've probably gone through a textbook by what's that? Who's our textbook authors? So Butler, Christensen, and so on. So they should be in the bibliography if you consulted them in trying to provide the answer to an assessment task, even if you may not actually have cited them in the body. In other words, they were not part of the footnotes. So that's what the bibliography is. And so, as I said, the bibliography and the footnotes will not be covered in the word count. Now, from Martin, P.S. one of my 3 units is admin. Wait, Martin, you're about to take admin, is that it? Or you've taken up administrative law? I kind of thought you're still taking up administrative law. Ah, okay. So you're taking up administrative law. Okay, good. So you will be my student, definitely, because I'm the only one teaching that. Okay, that's good. Yeah. Okay. The course I'm teaching in administrative law right now has seen one of the bigger enrollments. I have about 110 students there, which was quite surprising, because I don't recall administrative law ever having that many students, especially in term 3. And it's actually, I've got a good cohort this time, because a lot of them are actually HD students. And every time I have my tutorials, I have about 25% of the cohort attending, or even 30%. And a lot of them are HD students. So there's a lot of engagement going on, which means that they probably find the topic interesting because it might be applicable to them. So I look forward to being your lecturer as well, Martin, in administrative law. Now, are there any other questions? Oh, it's almost 8 o'clock. Do we have any other questions? We're all good? Okay, so I think we're done. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or post something in Moodle. I'll look it up. And so I wish you all the best in the final written assessment. I think this is just worth reminding you. I would strongly encourage you to revisit the tutorial videos, because that's when I really elaborated on the legal principles. You can read the textbooks, that's going to be important, but I think I may have provided some valuable insights as to the legal principles when I explain them in the course of the tutorials. And more importantly, as I said, the final questions I'll be asking in the final written assessment will be very similar to the type of questions asked in the tutorial problems. Okay, and Heidi, thank you for your feedback. In saying that, I've been doing well in the teaching, thank you. I'm hoping actually that all of you have actually spent some time doing the course evaluation. So I hope, whatever you think how this course was handled, I'm hoping that will be captured in the course evaluation. So I hope you can find time to do it. That shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. So again, thank you very much, all of you, because you've always been the ones who've been quite consistent in joining our tutorial session. So thank you for being there. And Martin especially, he deserves a special mention because he has contributed a lot to the engagement and to the learning in this course, because he's been very active in providing his insights and elaborating on the law. So you've really done well, Martin, and I appreciate what you've done for this course and for your classmates. And again, thank you everyone, Peter, Luke, Martin, Heidi, Sophie, Letitia, and Dominique for being part of this course. And I wish you well in our final written assessment. Okay, good night. See you soon. Yeah, so there's an event for young lawyers. Okay, good night everyone, bye.